Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be doing a very rambly video, sort of going through my motherboard history and, like, motherboard brand stereotypes, like my motherboard brand stereotypes, or like, what do I expect from like a typical Asus board or a typical Gigabyte board, typical MSI, Asrock motherboard. Because well, for one thing, I'm going to be doing a lot of motherboard content pretty soon since X670 is coming out, B650 is coming out soon, Z790 is going to be coming out shortly after that, probably. Um, and so, yeah, because of all of that, I figured it would be kind of worth sort of talking about, like, I guess you could call it my biases when it comes to the motherboard manufacturers, because as much as everybody would like to think they're completely impartial, that's just not true. Um, and Also because I regularly get asked the question of like, Buildzoid, which motherboard manufacturer do you trust the most? And I do kind of have an answer for it, but there's a great big asterisk next to that, so we'll get to that throughout the video. Um, and Yeah, and so we're gonna go sort of through like motherboards that I've dailied and like noteworthy motherboards or motherboards that stand out to me. And I'm just gonna talk about like what do I think of each brand in terms of like everything, I guess. Uh, yeah, and before we get into this, of course, let's do some exposures. So, first of all, Gigabyte sends me a lot of motherboard review samples. Too many, in fact. like, uh, the upside to that is if I ever need test subjects or occasionally even just parts off, like if I need parts, then I can just grab a random Gigabyte board and just use that because I do have way too many of them. So that's cool. And so that's Gigabyte. Gigabyte sends me a lot of boards. Um, then MSI sends me quite a few motherboards. Nowhere near the amount that Gigabyte does, but at least motherboards that I'm interested in covering, I'm generally able to get from MSI, at least on loan. Very recently, I've finally managed to get some Asus boards in without having to buy them, so that's cool. And I have no contact with Asrock whatsoever. And that's basically it. Yeah, so basically, I should be very Gigabyte biased based on, who sends me the most stuff. So keep that in mind throughout the video, because as much as I'd like to think that, Gigabyte sending me stuff doesn't affect my judgment, it, you know, like everybody would like to think that, that like there's going to be just a potentially just going to be a subconscious inherent bias due to that. But anyway, yeah, let's get into it. So my very first motherboard was daily motherboard was an ROG Rampage 4 Extreme. And this is a very good board. I still have it. I don't really like it's a bit the thing is I've not tested many other X79 boards, not to the extent that I tested this board because it was my daily board, but this was also a board that I was benching on at the time. Like I had two different Windows installs on the same computer. One of them which I was using daily and one of them was just like for benchmarking. And this was the board that I basically like first discovered overclocking on and learned overclocking, and I still have the board. I ended up water cooling the VRM on it because the VRM on this thing runs very freaking hot, which is typical of X79 boards because there's just not enough, like, there's just not enough space between the DIMM slots and the top edge of the motherboard to put a proper VRM up here. So, like, this is a 8-phase V-core, and half of the MOSFETs for the VRM are on the back of the board, which just means, like, it is. And also, these CPUs easily do over 300 watts, like, peak power consumption, so these boards run very, very, very hot. Um, yeah, but as far as actually using it goes, great board. I think in its current condition, the main complaint I have is that the postcode kind of died. Like, it doesn't work properly anymore, but I'm not sure why that happened. But yeah, this is like first motherboard, and I might be biased just because this was my first motherboard ever, but I like this board. Um, this was a very good board. Now, another board that I used a lot was the 990FX Sabertooth Revision 2. It was a secondary system that basically was like it was a secondary system that I had for a while. It had an FX6350 in it. The FX6350 kind of sucked. I still have the CPU. I don't have the board anymore because at some point I basically decided to start using this motherboard for LN2 overclocking, and it didn't last very long. Yeah, it got through a couple sessions, and then during some pre-testing on air cooling, it just kind of up and died. I never figured out why it failed. I tried to turn the board into an e-power. That also failed. I wasn't really that great at modding at the time. And sometimes building e-powers even now is like I'll cut something and it'll be like, it doesn't turn on and I don't want to know why. But yeah, like while the board worked, I don't really have any complaints on it. Well, the BIOS for this motherboard didn't have the BIOSes for this board don't have 1 core per module mode, which is pretty annoying if you're doing like max frequency on LN2 with FX CPUs, because most of the time you'll get your max frequency by disabling half the cores and by using the 1 core per module mode. Instead of having, with this board, you could go down to 1 core only, but you couldn't do 1 core per module, which is pretty annoying. But other than that, a solid motherboard, yeah, I don't really have any noteworthy complaints for it, and I did a lot of overclocking, and I liked it. Actually, no, I do have one complaint. If I remember correctly, PSC memory doesn't work on this board. Some of my DDR3 on this board is borderline non-functional, whereas it works fine on other AM3 Plus boards. So yeah, the board has the BIOS on this might have been a bit picky with memory, but at the time my memory collection wasn't that didn't have that much variety in it, so it wasn't really too much of a concern. And also, I was mainly using the board for just straight up frequency validations and Cinebench, and neither of those care about memory performance. So, yeah, that's just fine. So yeah, all around, I like this board, and as a daily board, it was great. Now then, the Rampage 5 Extreme. This was another board that I dailied. And this is the board that's responsible for me. Up until I got a Rampage 5 Extreme, I was pretty much convinced that Asus was the best motherboard manufacturer ever and that they could do no wrong. And then I got one of these things. This is the worst motherboard I have ever used. By far. Because, here's the thing. There are low-end motherboards that, power throttle, all that kind of thing. They don't run full speed. They're kind of slow. They overheat. They're generally unpleasant to work with. But they're $50 or $100, and what did you expect? This was one of the most expensive X99 motherboards available at the time, and it was unstable as hell. Rebooting would regularly lead to it just losing memory channels, as in, sometimes you'd turn on the computer, and instead of having all 4 memory channels initialized, you'd have 2, or 3, or 1. And the only way you'd find out if you only had 1 channel initialized is going into Task Manager, because if you pulled up CPU-Z would tell you that you have quad channel. But when you went into Task Manager, you'd see, oh, I only have 8 gigs of memory available, or 4 gigs of memory available, because at the time, 8 gig DDR3 DIMMs weren't really a thing, and there wasn't really, a reason to have, I didn't have a reason to have 32 gigs of memory in my computer, so I had 16 gigs, and so when it didn't initialize properly, oh, look, I'm on 4 gigs of RAM. I wonder why that is. So the board was just generally very flaky. Rebooting would regularly just not work properly. All of the complaints that somebody with a 1st gen Ryzen would have, this board did that too, except it did it more. So if you thought 1st gen Ryzen memory controller was an unstable mess, this is way worse. So much worse. Anyway, at one point in time, this board just outright completely freaking died. And when it did that, it tried to kill the 5960X that I had installed in it. So the 5960X that, when before the Rampage 5 Extreme dying occurred, that chip would go like 4.7 to 4.8 gigahertz on air cooling, depending on what workload you were running. And after this board died and tried to take the CPU with it, that chip would never go over 4.2 gigahertz again. So I hate this thing. When I got my RMA replacement for this board, I sold it without ever using it myself. Because at that point I had decided I am never touching one of these again. Ever. Never, ever. The only way I'm ever getting my hands on one of these is if I need it for spare parts. Because I am never turning one of these on again. Anyway, so this board is the reason why I basically stopped being an Asus fanboy. So good job, Asus, on that. Anyway, one of the boards I used for a bit after the Rampage incident was the X-Power Gaming Titanium. This board's really good. I really like it. Yeah, basically everything wrong with it doesn't do any of the things the Rampage did. It boots a lot faster. It recovers faster. Like, this is sort of the board where I realized that, like, MSI's BIOS is my favorite BIOS layout because it makes sense and they don't come up with weird names for things. So, yeah, like, this was a board that I dailied for a bit and I really like it. I still have it. I've used it for LN2 overclocking. I do have one complaint. The board has a cold bug at like -110 or -100-ish. So for Broadwell E, it's fine. For Haswell E, I think I need to try the board with a socket heater because it's possible that like the voltage regulator or something is just getting too cold and that's causing the board to flake out, because Haswell E CPUs are not supposed to like hard cold bug until like -120. This board starts having issues around -100, and it's not the usual cold bug behavior for Haswell where it just freezes up. It just starts being really flaky. It's weird. But yeah, like as a daily board, absolutely great. Like everything I complained about with the Rampage 5 Extreme, like this basically doesn't do. So yeah, this is a very, like, a motherboard I really like, and the board that sort of made me realize that, hey, I really like MSI BIOS. But anyway, eventually this board got moved to like permanent benchmarking duty, and so my daily system needed a new motherboard. And my new motherboard was a Gigabyte X99 UD4P. And the reason I went with this board is because I got it really cheap as an open box deal from overclockers.co.uk. And so, yeah, I dailied this thing for a bit. I had the absolute worst memory kit, worst kit of DDR4 I own installed in it. And so I can't really tell you much about this board in terms of like overclocking capabilities because like it overclocked the CPU fine. It had an OC socket. It didn't have random instability, but that's probably because the memory was at 2400 because the memory that I had in it was really, really bad. So yeah, but, you know, like, an okay motherboard that I don't really have any complaints for. So that's kind of neat. And then I dailied a Gigabyte X370 Gaming K5 because I basically decided, you know, I did the enthusiast thing of like, well, I was dailying a 5930K in this because, you know, I realized that I don't really need to... Like, I had a 60, like, so the 5960X eventually got replaced with a 6950X. The 6950X acted as a bench CPU in the X-Power Gaming Titanium, and my daily was on a 5930K. I basically decided that, you know, the 5930K runs really hot. And I'd like to switch over to a Ryzen 7 1700. So I did that. And the board that I used initially was this Gigabyte X370 Gaming K5. This board's noteworthy because it's one of the few X370 motherboards from Gigabyte with a dedicated clock gen. Unfortunately, so that's kind of neat. The VRM is not great, runs very hot. The voltage control is convoluted AF because this doesn't have a proper, like, fully digital voltage regulator. It's a hybrid thing, and the way that Gigabyte's BIOS interacts with it is just a horrible mess. So voltage monitoring on this board is actually, like, in software is pretty broken, which is quite impressive because, like, the CPU is supposed to get its voltage monitoring data directly from the VRM. But as soon as you start manually overclocking on one of these, that just stops working correctly, which is like peak Gigabyte. I have no idea how they manage that because there are other motherboards using the exact same voltage controller that don't have this issue, but this one does. And actually, all of the boards from Gigabyte with this VRM design have that same problem. Also, the VRM on this runs quite hot, but that's not really that much of a concern for a Ryzen 7 1700. Also, I was dailying it with a downdraft air cooler, so not really, like for me personally, not an issue. The main complaint I do have for this board, other than sort of like the VRM being kind of weird and not that great, is Gigabyte put out a BIOS update for this motherboard, which they did take down, but they put out a beta BIOS, which shoved like 1.5 volts into the SoC of my CPU. That CPU, since then, is completely incapable of getting into Windows without at least like 1.15 volts of SoC voltage. Like basically you need to crank up the SoC voltage on that chip just to get it to function like at a basic level. Now, funnily enough, that chip can still overclock memory. It's just like it doesn't work at stock settings, which is, yeah. So that's fun. So that's my Gigabyte daily motherboard experience. I also dailied an X370 Tai because, yeah. I mean, I still have this board and I still want to, like, I still use it for some, I used it for some experiments and, yeah, like, the thing is, the main issue with this board is basically the VRM and that BIOS update. But if that BIOS update never happened, I would have not had a second major complaint for this board. Then again, you know, like Gigabyte really shouldn't allow BIOS updates like that to be a thing, but then like it was a beta BIOS, so yeah, I don't know, but like at least so you know, in terms of motherboards damaging CPUs, we have both the Rampage 5 and this thing, but this thing killed itself. This thing just straight up died. This still works. Like, as long as you don't put that BIOS on it, which I don't think you can even get it on the internet unless you really go digging for it, this board's fine. So, yeah, anyway, eventually I switched over an X370 Tai. Basically because I realized, like, initially my plan was that I wanted to daily this board and use this board for LN2 overclocking, but I found out during an LN2 overclocking attempt that this board doesn't have all of the necessary voltage controls, and so I decided, okay, I'll just stick it in my daily system. And this board eventually, like, and so I have two complaints for this board. One, this board is just straight up worse at memory overclocking than this is. And two, this eventually just developed a really weird instability where it can't run LinPack. Like, it just can't run LinPack. I've tried updating the BIOS. I've tried different CPUs. It doesn't run LinPack. I don't know why. It just crashes if I try to run LinPack on it. So, yeah, and I've not really been too bothered about fixing it because even when the board worked, like, it wasn't a bad motherboard, but it wasn't an incredible motherboard. So, yeah. Anyway, eventually I switched over to this thing because, yeah, the whole, like, my system keeps crashing for no reason, and I have evidence, and I have reason to believe that it's due to the motherboard because of the whole, hey, it can't run LinPack. Actually, I don't think it was even straight up LinPack. I think it was straight up Intel burn test, which is a bit lighter than LinPack. So yeah, this wouldn't run Intel burn test. And so I was like, okay, I'll just swap the motherboard and that should make the instability go away. And it did. And the board that I ended up using was the X470 Gaming Pro Carbon. And this is all around just a very solid motherboard again. You know, BIOS is fine. I mean, I wish it had VTT DDR control, but not really the end of the world. VRM is good. Really can't complain about that. It's not the coolest running VRM to be ever put on an X470 motherboard, but it's good. Like, it does a perfectly acceptable job. It's not gonna, like, you could run a 3950X in this just fine. So, yeah, that's not really, or a 5950X. I guess I could even test that. I still have this board. I wanted to get rid of it, but I didn't manage to get around to doing that. But, yeah, so I dailied this thing for a bit, and eventually, well, what's currently in my daily system is an X570 Aorus Extreme Revision 1.0. And the reason I'm now dailying an X570 Aorus Extreme is because I just kind of had this dumb idea. It's like, it would be cool to daily a high-end motherboard. The thing about the revision 1.0 version of the Aorus Extreme is it has a memory topology that's just like a lot worse than what they have on the revision 1.1 boards. And I actually wonder if, oh, they don't have it on the board. I wonder if we could pull that up on a different revision 1.0. Because basically the issue with that board, or that memory, with the memory topology is, like, it wasn't the best X570 memory topology at launch, but it's worse now. Like, on the newest BIOSes, it's actually just worse. Because the newer Gigabyte boards have a completely different memory topology. And so, as far as I can tell, or at least my theory is, that like the BIOS updates have basically been neglecting the topology that's on this board. And so this has been getting steadily worse at memory overclocking rather than better. And I was kind of hoping that we'd have like a clear... Oh, Gigabyte doesn't do that, I guess. Because some motherboard manufacturers will put a... I think Asrock does this a lot, where they'll put like a speed rating around the memory topology area. Right? Oh, they don't have it on the Tai Chi. I guess with yeah, I guess that's not a thing anymore. Because that was definitely a thing for DDR3 boards. Like, you'd have like DDR3 2200 plus next to the memory slots and that kind of thing. But yeah, I guess with AMD controlling the memory controller initialization that like so tightly, making a commitment to any memory speed is just not really a good idea. I wonder if this got the... Yeah, no, it dropped. So on some of the early BIOSes, these boards should be able to do like 4600 and somewhat higher than that. But on the latest BIOSes, yeah, 4400 is the limit. So there goes the whole like, I wanted to daily a high-end motherboard. But to be fair, the board works like, well, this is the thing, is like the board works just fine. But I do kind of wish that my personal, like, it's not even like a performance thing. It's just like, I run an overclocking YouTube channel. And for the longest time, like, and even now, like, my daily system is basically built from spare parts, which is why I stuck a revision 1.0 Extreme into my daily, because, like, what am I going to do with a motherboard that just doesn't clock that RAM that great, right? In terms of content. Also, if anybody buys a, like, the revision 1.0 boards weren't even available for, I don't think they were even available for that long. So, like, at this point, you know, showing how the revision 1.0 boards behave is not even relevant. So, yeah, I didn't really have any content plans for this motherboard, and so it stuck it in my daily system. I really wish I had stuck something with a better memory topology in my daily system, but here we are. Not because it would have made a significant difference in terms of performance. I wouldn't, like, notice the difference, but just because it feels like it's kind of, you know, it just kind of frustrates me, where it's like, I run an overclocking channel. My daily system is not good at overclocking. Why do I do this to myself? Anyway, yeah. And so that's the sort of history of like daily motherboards in my system. And man, this video is going to be really long. And so I guess the best experiences I have with like daily motherboards would be the MSI boards, right? Like, I don't really have any major complaints about this board. I don't really have... Oh, no, I do have a complaint about this one. Not enough USB ports. Yeah, this board, I straight up used every single USB port in the back, and I needed a... Like, I had a USB 3.0 to, like, PCIe adapter thing when I was dailying this board. Don't need that anymore with the X5... with the Aorus Extreme. So, I just wish it was better at memory overclocking. There. Yeah, don't need any more USB port expansion cards. Yeah, like honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if this was actually better at memory overclocking than my car. No. I wonder. I really do wonder. Because I don't think it's necessarily impossible that this couldn't outclock the extreme. I don't think I'm bothered to like. I don't think I'll bother testing that, but that would be kind of funny if this was actually just better at memory overclocking. On the flip side, this doesn't have DDR control, whereas this does. Um, so yeah, anyway, so that's sort of my daily boards. And pretty much consistently, it's been like, yeah, the MSI boards were fine. And so they got like shifted over to, doing better things than being my video production machine. Because I don't edit, so I don't actually need like a good video production system, right? Um, anyway, other noteworthy motherboards. The Gigabyte 990FX Gaming. And the reason I bring up this board is because I have this board. This is like my favorite AM3 Plus LN2 motherboard, except for one problem. The VRM. The VRM on this board runs so freaking hot on LN2 at idle. Okay, now admittedly this is with like FX CPUs, but at idle, this VRM kicks off so much heat that like on most motherboards, when you run them on LN2, at least like motherboards designed for extreme overclocking, when you run them on LN2, the VRM has a tendency to end up covered in ice just because it's like there's a great big power plane between the CPU socket and the VRM, and the CPU's at like minus 100 degrees Celsius. And so the LN2 pot just sucks the heat right out of the board and therefore sucks the heat right out of the VRM. The VRM ends up going subambient and condensation forms all over it, and eventually it freezes over. Which is why you need insulation or you need like a PCB heater. You don't need any of that with this board. Well, you still need insulation, but you don't need a PCB heater on this board because this VRM produces enough heat at idle to keep itself at above room temperature, which not great. Another concern is that this board will just straight up shut down if you try to run any multi-core benchmarks with like an 8-core FX CPU above like 5.5 gigahertz. At least as long as I guess maybe you could find some chips that can do high clocks at very low voltage. But basically, if you're going to be pushing an 8-core FX chip, this board is going to shut down, is what it's going to do. Because the VRM just can't. And so at this point, you might be like, Buildzoid, why isn't this your favorite like LN2 AM3 Plus board? It's really good at validations. It clocks memory great. It's great for Phenom 2s, which don't pull quite as much power as the FX chips. Like, I just wish it had a better VRM, right? Like, I really wish it had a better VRM. But like BIOS and memory wise and like OC recovery, like this recovers so fast, it boots fast, like it's great. And the VRM is just horrible. And the VRM is just horrible. So this is like a noteworthy motherboard in my collection because it's been, yeah, like I still have it. It still works. It's not a board that I'm in any hurry to get rid of. In fact, I bought a 970 UD3P board, which is a much cheaper motherboard, but with the same VRM as this board. And the idea is basically I have a bunch of like modifications I want to test on the 970 UD3P to try get the VRM to suck less. And if those modifications work, I might adapt those I might put those modifications on my 990FX gaming, or I might just use the 970 UD3P instead because I think the like memory topology and everything is the same because this is a 4-layer PCB. Yeah, that's another fun fact. Like this is actually just a straight up better memory overclocking board than this was. But the VRM on this is a dumpster fire compared to this. The VRM on this is really nice. And the memory on this is like memory support BIOS is very nice on this. I really wish the motherboard, like the EasyTune software, wasn't a buggy pile of trash. But I'd consider that a relatively minor complaint. And no, because I need EasyTune for BCLK adjustment. Ugh. Yeah, I wish Easy Tune wasn't terrible, but oh well. Like for all of the other benefits of this motherboard, I'm willing to put up with the necessary evil that is Gigabyte's Easy Tune software because it is really awful. Anyway, another noteworthy motherboard, this thing is a bit more modern, the B550 Steel Legend. This board has me incredibly impressed for a few reasons. It is not very expensive. It has a postcode. The VRM will power any CPU you put into the socket, and at least using a not the best measurement technique ever, but a measurement technique. This seems to have absolutely incredible core voltage regulation. Like this right now is at the top of like AM4 motherboards that I tested VRM performance on in terms of voltage regulation. In terms of thermals, it's not that great. It does run quite hot. It's, as far as I can tell, this is a 4-layer PCB. But yeah, the voltage regulation is really, really good for such a unimpressive VRM. So yeah, also the memory overclocking on this board is solid. Like Asrock says 4733 plus. Quite frankly, if they said 4933 plus, I wouldn't complain. It does a great job of even 4x8 memory setups. Like yeah, like this thing is just like if every budget Asrock motherboard was like this, I wouldn't complain about Asrock motherboards. I wish the BIOS wasn't Asrock BIOS. I will say that. Like Asrock's BIOS is definitely not my favorite. Like if I had to rank the motherboard manufacturers by BIOS, I'd say MSI in first place, Gigabyte and Asus tied for second, Asrock in third, and that's kind of that. I'd also, I guess, actually no, MSI for the thing is, like, I have different complaints for, like, Asus and Gigabyte. Like, both Asus and Gigabyte suffer from having too many submenus, right? Like, there's just menus for menus for menus. So if there's, like, a specific setting that you're looking for on a Gigabyte board or an Asus board, you need to know which submenu it's in. And that can be possibly, like, 3-4 menus deep, right? Which is annoying. If you don't use those boards all day, every day, it's not realistic to remember in which submenu every single setting is. And so if you're like an Asus motherboard user, that's not a problem. If you're a Gigabyte motherboard user, it's not a problem. But if you're switching between them on an infrequent basis, like I am, where it's like I used a lot of Asus boards, and so when I first got Gigabyte boards, I thought they were stupid. I thought the layout was stupid. Now, recently, I've been using a lot more Gigabyte, so now when I use an Asus board, I think the Asus layout is stupid. So the conclusion from that is both of their layouts are stupid, and they should copy MSI. MSI just has a great big long list of all of the settings and minimal submenus, which I much prefer. Because it means there's less digging through menus, and like scrolling is just better than digging through menus as far as I'm concerned. Even though I think probably like if you knew where everything was, it might take about the same amount of time. I'd much rather just have to scroll, instead of remembering which submenu some random CPU configuration setting is in. And then there's Asrock BIOS. Asrock BIOS has submenus for submenus. Asrock BIOS is incredibly clunky in terms of like there are settings that don't behave the way that you'd expect them to behave. There are settings that don't do anything at all. That's always a fun thing about Asrock BIOS because sometimes it feels like they just copy pasted the BIOS from a higher end motherboard onto a lower end motherboard, and functionality that's present on the high end board that doesn't exist on the low end board is somehow still in the BIOS, but it doesn't do anything. It's just kind of there. And so Asrock BIOS is just like the worst. And to make things even worse, they have a bunch of automation. So on this board specifically, and the main reason I don't use it as much as I would as much as I would maybe like to, is that like at certain memory speeds, the board will preload a bunch of memory timings for you. And when you change the voltage, it changes your LLC setting for you. So, and the thing that I hate about this is like, look, if I set the LLC to level 3, I want it to be at level 3. That when I change the voltage from 1.35 volts to 1.37, don't reset my LLC setting to level 1. That is stupid. Right? Like, that's my complaint for Asrock BIOS, is there's too much automation in it. It should never do any of that, basically, as far as I'm concerned. And also, like, the timing preset that it loads up at 4933 is just bad. Like, it should not do that. And there's, like... So that's the kind of complaints that I have for Asrock BIOS, is just, like, Asrock BIOS takes, like, the mess and jankiness of like a Gigabyte BIOS and cranks it up to 11 and then adds a bunch of automation on top of it. That's just annoying and gets in the way. So that's why I think Asrock BIOS is the worst. In terms of actually having all of the features available, they actually do a good job because they forget to delete things, as far as I can tell. Again, like it's not that uncommon to have an Asrock motherboard with a bunch of settings that don't do anything because those things are physically not supported by the board. But they're still there because they forgot to remove them. But, Asrock. Whereas, like Gigabyte BIOS has quite a few settings that work in strange ways, but nothing that like conflicts with itself or... Actually, I think there's been a few cases of Gigabyte BIOS having settings that don't do it. I can't think of a Gigabyte BIOS where they had settings for things that aren't physically present on the motherboard, though. So, yeah. I think that's like an Asrock special, where it's like settings for things that aren't physically on the motherboard. Anyway, so Gigabyte BIOS, hard to navigate, yep. Hard to use if you're not used to it, yep. But also, like, I feel like if you use Gigabyte BIOS long enough, you just kind of get used to it. Similar to Asus BIOS, where there's submenus for everything. Asus also has horrible naming conventions. Like, which is, yeah, like Asus likes to come up with creative names for settings instead of just using a sensible name or the conventional name or like, a setting name that is like transferable between motherboard manufacturers. Asus is over here coming up with new and creative voltage names, measurements, time. Actually, they don't have... The thing is, so it's kind of annoying because like Asus BIOS, I think, has like memory timing names in their full like long form instead of just the shortcut for them. So if you tell somebody like TRRD, I think on Asus boards that's row to row delay. And I think it says TRRD somewhere near that, but it's like, why? So, yeah, and I am saying all of this over an Asrock board. So basically, and then there's MSI. And MSI's BIOS, the only complaint I have for it is that on a lot of motherboards, especially in the past, they wouldn't have VTT DDR control, which is pretty stupid. The only two manufacturers that consistently have good VTT DDR control are Asrock and Gigabyte, because Asrock and Gigabyte can't be bothered to delete those settings, which is a good thing, because here's the thing. The VTT DDR regulator, like the actual chip that deals with converting DRAM voltage into VTT DDR, like, it's the same chip on an X570 Aorus Extreme as it is on a B550 Vision D-P, as it is on a A520 board from Gigabyte. And so the BIOS settings that interact with that chip to control the VTT DDR are the same across all of the boards, because it's the same damn chip. So they just use, so it works everywhere equally. Meanwhile, on MSI boards, a lot of them just don't have VTT DDR for whatever reason. Like, as far as I know, they just physically didn't configure those boards to have it configure, like, to have an adjustable VTT DDR, because by spec, VTT DDR is always supposed to be half your memory voltage. If you're overclocking, you don't always want it to be half memory voltage. There are memory chips where it's better to have it slightly higher or slightly lower. Asus, on the other hand, has full proper VTT DDR control on their high-end boards, but on their less high-end boards, like Strix boards, you'll have VTT DDR control that's partial, as in you'll be only able to raise it up instead of being able to lower it. And funnily enough, I've never encountered a memory kit where raising the VTT DDR voltage did anything. So I really don't know why Asus, well, actually I do know why. It's so that you buy the more expensive Asus boards. So that's kind of the thing. And then Asrock has VTT DDR on like every motherboard that I've ever used from them, because Asrock takes the same approach that Gigabyte does. Is like, it's the same chip doing the same thing. We're just going to copy the BIOS code across all of the boards. We're not going to artificially segment our product line because it's physically the same damn thing, right? And so that's really cool of Asrock. If the rest of their BIOS wasn't a horrible pile of junk, or jank, I should say, it's not junk, it's janky. Like, everything's there, it's just kind of, annoying to work with. Then I would like Asrock boards a lot more, because they're generally very feature complete. Not always the best, but generally very feature complete in terms of BIOS things. Now, MSI, well, this is one of the boards where they do have VTT DDR control for AM4, but yeah, MSI's BIOS, I think MSI's BIOS layout is the best. Now, admittedly, a lot of it is great big long lists, but like I mentioned earlier, I'd much rather scroll than have to figure out which submenu something is in, right? Because like the submenus are annoying, because it's like, oh, you go down one, because you have to go down one branch of submenus and then go back up the branch and then go down the other branch of submenus, and it's just like, it might ultimately take just as many keystrokes, but mentally it's just way more work and annoying, right? So I prefer the MSI approach of like, there's an overclocking menu where you have all of the settings basically, and then there's a few submenus for like CPU specific settings, memory timings, as well as all of the memory. Like, and when it's memory timings, it's all of the memory timings, right? On an Asus board, you'll have like your memory timings menu, and in your memory timings menu, you'll have your RTL timings menu and your, I think, terminations menu. And for some ungodly reason, Asus measures termination resistances in clock cycles, which doesn't make any sense. But if you actually go into the termination menu of like any recent Asus motherboard, they measure termination resistance in clock cycles. I'm not making that up. You can go and check it yourself if you have an Asus board. They measure freaking termination resistance in clock cycles, because Asus likes to come up with creative names to obfuscate what their BIOS settings are doing, which I find incredibly annoying. Like, it's not the end of the world. You can totally get used to it, but why can't they just use normal naming conventions? Anyway, MSI doesn't do any of that, except for like the MSI Lucky Mode setting, which, like, I've asked about it. It's just a like alternative memory training procedure that they have. It's not really like, and I think it's meant for like max frequency or something. Anyway, yeah, so MSI's BIOS layout, in my opinion, is the best. All of the settings are in reasonable places. All of the settings have reasonable names. Like, MSI's BIOS, in terms of layout and function, makes sense. And nobody else's does. So, basically, that's my opinion on MSI BIOS layout. Is like, this is... Because here's the thing. Like, if I pick up a board like this, right? And this is a board I like, and it's a board I've used a lot. When I pick this board up after a few months, or maybe a year or two, and I turn it on, and I go into the BIOS, I get to relearn how all of it works. At least, okay, that's not entirely true, but I get to relearn a lot of how it works. Because Gigabyte BIOS design isn't consistent, right? Like, and the same is true like this board or this board. Actually, especially going from X99, like, oh man, the layout on Gigabyte X99 compared to modern Gigabyte is so different. And it's also different from like this Gigabyte. And that's like, it's another, like a complaint for Gigabyte BIOS. It's inconsistent across their own motherboard lines because they keep trying to, like, here's the issue with the Gigabyte BIOS situation. People keep complaining about Gigabyte BIOS, so Gigabyte keeps changing it, and it never gets better. So they keep, like, and so one of the issues you end up with is that the Gigabyte BIOS is even confusing to, like, lifelong Gigabyte users like me. Like, I've used 990FX Gigabyte boards. I've used X99 Gigabyte boards, Z87, Z97, Z270 Gigabyte boards, Z370, Z390, X299 Gigabyte boards, and they're not consistent. Well, more recently, it's been better. The DDR4, well, the later DDR4 BIOSes are relatively consistent. Like Z370 onwards, it's not completely all over the place. But yeah, if you try to go like older than that, it's just like totally different BIOSes, totally different. And so, yeah, like I pick up an old Gigabyte board and I have to like rediscover how this BIOS works and where everything is. Whereas I can pick up, like I've picked up a DDR3 MSI motherboard, an X79 MSI motherboard. I turned it on and I immediately knew where everything was because everything was in that great big stupid list of settings. Imagine that. Instead of burying things in submenus that nobody can remember, you could just put all the settings in the same place, in a list, organized in some reasonable order, like frequency settings, voltage settings. And then you can have submenus for things like the VRM configuration and all of the memory settings. Yes, all of them in one place, not in two, not, a submenu with then two more submenus in that. No. One menu, everything in it. Terminations, RTLs, all of the timings, any actually, I think MSI does now have a submenu for like training options because it would kind of make the list ridiculous. But, like that's still better than the Asus situation where actually on Asus boards, I think you have some training options in the main tweaker tab. Then there's a training submenu. There's an RTL IOL submenu. There's so anybody who tells me that Asus BIOS is better than Gigabyte BIOS is really all they're saying is I use more Asus boards than I use Gigabyte boards. Because if you use more Gigabyte boards than Asus boards, going the other way around is the same. Like it feels the same to me. The only exception to this is MSI. MSI has a reasonable BIOS layout. I can pick up any MSI motherboard with the confidence of knowing that I won't have to spend an annoying amount of time searching for a setting that I'm pretty sure exists, I just don't remember where it went, right? Which is not true for like Asus boards, Asrock boards, or Gigabyte boards, because all of them are a mess. And some of them have some weird bugs. Actually, speaking of weird BIOS bugs, MSI had some on AM4 has like, I'm not sure if it's still around, but there was a bug where like your BIOS profiles wouldn't work properly. Saving BIOS profiles on Asrock boards is kind of clunky. Gigabyte's BIOS profile saving feature is my favorite one. Also, Gigabyte has a last known good function, which as long as you boot all the way into Windows, it'll remember your last settings. So if you clear CMOS, they're still there. Super convenient on AM4 because on AM4, AMD keeps trying to implement a garbage tier safe boot function that doesn't work half the time, or really, actually half the time is giving them too much credit. It barely ever works. So last known good on Gigabyte motherboards for AM4, amazing. I love it. I use it way too much. Like I am a last known good freaking addict. Asus doesn't have that. Saving profiles on Asus motherboards after using a Gigabyte motherboard is quite the experience. On Gigabyte, you press F3, you select which profile slot you want to use, you punch in a name, you press enter, profile saved. Asus boards, there's a freaking submenu only for saving profiles. There's no shortcut for it, right? Like I think on Gigabyte motherboards, you could intentionally go to like I think there's like a profile saving submenu somewhere. I haven't been in that submenu for ages because I remember the shortcut. But on Asus board, I've tried checking if there's a shortcut. I couldn't find one. So I'm going to go with there isn't one, and saving profiles on Asus boards is freaking annoying. Anyway, so basically, yeah, as far as BIOSes are concerned, MSI's BIOS is best. I wish they just copied like Gigabyte's profile saving function. Also, MSI's BIOS forces you to use the mouse to set fan curves, which is stupid. Gigabyte's BIOS doesn't force you to do that. So actually, I guess maybe I would rank Gigabyte above Asus. Because I like Gigabyte's fan control. And I also really like their BIOS profile saving feature and last known good. And they consistently have VTT-DDR. On the other hand, their BIOS is truly like an experience. Because like this is the issue. I'm so used to the Gigabyte jank that like a lot of the things that other people would like, they turn on a Gigabyte motherboard and they're like, why doesn't X do X? And it's like, well, that's because X is actually Y. And I'm so used to X being Y that it's like not really a concern for me anymore. So no, I'm going to leave Gigabyte and Asus as tied for second place. MSI gets first. I just wish MSI had better BIOS profile saving functionality. Actually, like MSI does have a shortcut for saving profiles. I don't know why I don't use it more. I think I might be just paranoid about saving profiles on MSI boards because of the bug where they would randomly not work. Like they wouldn't stick. As in like they disappear after some reboots for some reason. Anyway, yeah, the B550 Unify X is in this list as a noteworthy motherboard because this thing is an absolute memory overclocking monster. It's great. I don't have any AM4 motherboard that clocks memory so well. And so I wanted to include it in this list as a noteworthy recent motherboard that, like, you know, yeah, like I just wanted to point it out. It's a noteworthy motherboard. It's a motherboard I like. Unfortunately, it's not a motherboard that I use as much as my B550 Vision D-P because of all of the like Gigabyte basically profile saving functionality and last known good, and like Gigabyte boards recover from failed overclocks way cleaner than MSI, especially on liquid nitrogen. Like at ambient, the auto recovery is pretty similar in that it's basically broken. Thank you, AMD. Very cool. However, on LN2 with an MSI motherboard, it is super, super annoying. Because I tried to run my 5950X on LN2 with this board, and I very quickly decided that actually I just want to run it on the Vision. I did do some memory validations on LN2 with this board, and that was okay. But yeah, when I tried to run the 5950X and I was actually serious about pushing the CPU, the flakiness of this board's auto recovery and just saving profiles and keeping track of them, like, this is so much better. Like, this board just does that so much better. And in terms of memory overclocking, there's not that much of a gap between these. Like this, I've managed, like, best validation on air cooling is like 5850 megabits per second. This does 5750. Actually, I think I got 5900 out of this. So there's like 150 megabit per second difference between these two boards in terms of max memory speed. And that, like the funny thing is, if you're if you're running a Ryzen like CPU and not an APU, that difference shrinks because the memory controller can't do clocks that high anyway. And so yeah, when it comes to LN2, it's just like I would much rather have more reliable recovery than, you know, absolutely the best memory topology on B550. So yeah, and this is included as a noteworthy motherboard because this is currently my favorite, like, AM4 board. I love this thing. I have one complaint for it, though, the VRM. And this time, so you might be noticing a trend at this point. We have a pretty consistent, like, this is a Gigabyte motherboard. I really like it, but this part is not good. So we had, I like it, but the memory topology is garbage. I like it, but the VRM is garbage. I like it, but the VRM is not amazing. This one isn't garbage. This one is. This one's really, really, really bad. This one, I wish the voltage regulation was better. In terms of thermals, it's good. In terms of power delivery, it's good. Voltage rate, like, well, yeah, thermals, like how much power it can handle, it's fine. The voltage regulation, not great. Literally worse than this. Yeah. And by a pretty large margin at that. Now, I'm not going to give you hard numbers because I'm not convinced by the test methodology that I used yet, but not great. Like, very much, I wish the voltage regulation on this board was so much better. But another thing is, like, this board also has dual X8 support, which the Unify X doesn't have, which is another thing that, yeah, it's just like, I wish it had dual X8 support. This has better auto recovery. Like, I really like this board. I just wish it had a better VRM. So that's another sort of noteworthy board. So basically, like, the complaint I have for basically Gigabyte would be like, please make one motherboard where all of the good things come together. Okay? All of them. Not just like amazing memory topology, but the VRM is not the best. Or the VRM is amazing, but the memory topology isn't. Or like, you know, like that's the thing. And then also the BIOS is just kind of jank. But I really don't know how Gigabyte's supposed to fix that. And also at this point, I use Gigabyte BIOS so much that I am just used to it. So I don't have those complaints that most people would have for Gigabyte BIOS because I'm so used to it, right? So, and it's that's kind of the thing. So, yeah, I really just I wish Gigabyte could just one board where everything is good at the same time. And to be fair, like the Z690 Tachyon gets pretty close to doing that. Great VRM, great memory topology. Actually, it's like the thing is, I don't think the Tachyon is the best DDR5 motherboard. I feel like that would either go to a good revision Apex or a dark. But I'm pretty sure the Tachyon's at least second. Well, depends on your goals, because if you want RTL training, then actually the Tachyon's BIOS doesn't always, like, then, yeah. That's the thing, is like Gigabyte gets very, very close to making the perfect motherboard, and then they just don't. Because actually, funnily enough, Gigabyte does have 990FX boards which have better VRMs than this, and still have the great BIOS that this has, but the VRM on the other motherboards doesn't have the voltage range of this one. This VRM has up to 2.3 volts output voltage. And then there's boards from Gigabyte like the... let me just get the AMD chipsets. Oh, they don't have any of the 990FX listed. Oh, that sucks. But anyway, I have a 990FX UD5, and the UD5 tops out at like 1.9 volts, which is plenty for a Phenom 2. It's not enough for an FX, which is really stupid. So that board has like a way better VRM than this does. Still the same great memory topology, still the same great like BIOS support, auto like recovery behavior. Everything's great. The VRM doesn't shut down under load. It doesn't do the same level of voltage. Like, Gigabyte probably made the perfect 990FX board. It's just like not one motherboard. It's several of them. Like, there's bits and pieces of it across multiple different boards. Which is just like... So that's kind of the Gigabyte experience, I guess. Anyway, I included the Maximus 12 Apex because this is just a really good board that I really like. Yeah. Makes LN2 overclocking super easy, memory overclocking super easy. It has safe boot. Like, yeah, just an all-around really great motherboard. Best Z490 Asus board there is. And then there's this thing, which is like this is the thing. Great board, good board, garbage. Great board. Also, this is actually a good board as well. The reason I pulled this board in is because I wanted to point out, so this is a really good board, but it took Asus way too long to put out a BIOS update for this motherboard that fixed compatibility with A2 PCB-based memory sticks, which is stupid because A2 is like the better memory topology for DDR4. Like, A0 was the initial launch memory stick layout and was basically designed for DDR4 2133. A0 memory sticks will generally top out in terms of speed somewhere between 4400. Well, actually, I've seen some that top out at 4266, But yeah, they'll top out at like 4266 up to 4800. A2 consistently does 4800 plus. Unfortunately, it took Asus like a couple months before they put out a BIOS update for this motherboard that fixed A2 PCB support, which is just like... Also, this board was not like new, like the A2 PC memory PCB was not a new thing when this board came out. Like that PCB had been around for ages. And I don't know how Asus manages to just like completely ignore the fact that there's a totally normal memory stick layout called A2 and their motherboard just doesn't really support it for like months. So anyway, but once they dealt with that, this is actually a very good board. Yeah, I just wish they did that way sooner because I had this board for a while and it was just completely unusable for me for memory overclocking because none of my memory sticks are A0. Like I don't have, actually no, I have two A0 B-die sticks today. But when I got this board, I didn't have any A0 sticks. So I was stuck at like 4400 CL17 because anything lower than that just wouldn't post. And also that was 4400 CL17 with trash like not amazing subtimings or anything. It like, yeah, that was the best thing I could run. There are motherboards that can daily 4417, and that was like max bench settings on this one for me, because like 4400 CL16 just wouldn't post no matter what I did, until they put out a BIOS update, and then there's a option that you turn on, and suddenly A2 PCBs work, which is just like, why couldn't we have that sooner? Anyway, so great board. This really don't have any complaints for this. Just great board, amazing board. I wish every Asus board was like this. This I wish the BIOS updates came out faster. And then there's this thing. So this board is another, like, it's not anywhere near as bad as this was because this thing straight up like it died and it sucked. This, on the other hand. So the issue is there's like two versions of this motherboard as far as, actually no, there's more than two versions, but the big division is between motherboards made in 2021 and motherboards made in 2022. If you get one of these that was produced in 2022, it should be amazing at memory overclocking. If you get one made in 2021, there's a very high probability that your A channel sucks. And when I say sucks, I mean maxes out at like 6400. Yeah. And so, you know, my overall impression of like Gigabyte is sort of like, we may, like, if we could just put all the best parts of our boards onto one board instead of like 5 different boards, we would have an incredible motherboard. Asus is like, their top-end boards, I come in one of two variants. Very good or very bad. No in between. Right? Like, great, terrible. Great, I mean, it's still not as bad as the Rampage 5 Extreme. By, like, because it had, like, it's not suicidal and it doesn't randomly fail to train and that kind of thing. Like, it does have the training inconsistency that's typical of 12th gen Intel CPUs when pushing high memory speeds, but that's Intel 12th gen. I don't blame Asus for that. Like, every board does that. But, yeah, this thing, you know, not particularly amazing. This was borderline unusable for several months because of, you know, just lack of support for certain memory sticks, which is hilarious. So basically my perception of Asus is like, well, it's kind of like Gigabyte. I just wish they made more boards like this and less boards like this. And with Gigabyte, it's kind of like, more of this, please, but could you do some, like, maybe put this VRM onto this? Actually, maybe... So the funny thing is, there's actually a few Gigabyte boards that I tested that have a very similar VRM to what the Aorus Extreme has, but they perform even worse than the Vision does. And I know that doesn't make any sense, but, like, that's Gigabyte for you. Is just the like Asus is kind of inconsistent. Like, to be fair to Asus, actually, no. I almost said I've never tested a truly terrible Asus board, but that's like, no, I did. It's this. But like, yeah, no, there's just no consistency. Like the only brand where I can't say I've had an absolutely nightmarish experience with one of their products is MSI. And I'm pretty sure that's because I have fewer MSI boards than I have almost anybody else except Asrock. Because I've had very few Asrock motherboards and pretty consistently had terrible experiences with the BIOS. So I generally avoid Asrock boards. So I have very few Asrock boards, even compared to like MSI boards. But MSI and like Gigabyte and Asus drastically outnumber MSI in my motherboard collection, especially Gigabyte, thanks to all of the review samples that I get sent. And so I've never had a truly terrible MSI board. I'm sure they've made one. I just haven't happened to stumble across it. Asus and Gigabyte, on the other hand, is just kind of like, well, Gigabyte, I just wish they were more consistent in general. And then Asus is like, you need to stop making things like this and this. Because, like, I don't even get how this happens. Like, how do you make a motherboard entirely focused on memory overclocking and have issues where the A channel randomly is, like, unusable? Right? Because, like, my Apex on the B channel, it'll do over 7,000. Easy. On the A channel, it's a good day of 6,400 posts. So, yeah. So that's sort of my manufacturer, like that. This is why I got into like testing motherboards, is like, because you can't trust these brands. The moment you go like, oh yeah, my previous Apex was amazing, I'm gonna buy another Apex, it sucks. Right? Like that's sort of the whole point of this video, is just like, or with Gigabyte, where it's like, well, this has a great VRM, but the memory topology is terrible. This has a great memory topology, but the VRM's not great. Which, why can't we have both? Just one motherboard where everything works at the same time. I mean, like, and now you might be like, Buildzoid, why don't you only use MSI boards? Great question. I don't know. Actually, I do know. Like, I complained about the mouse control for forced use of mouse for fan control in the BIOS, which is stupid. It shouldn't require the mouse, ever. And the whole BIOS profile saving thing. Also, the really flaky auto recovery on AM4 specifically. I don't know why it does that. Yeah. Like, to be fair, the auto recovery on AM4 is kind of broken with every brand, in my experience. But on MSI, it's like extra broken. And I think it's because MSI is actually trying to have like because on Intel boards, MSI's auto recovery is amazing. It's really good. And then on AMD boards, I think it's like a conflict between MSI's really, really great auto recovery and AMD's absolutely god awful auto recovery. And the two of them collide and nothing works. And it just ends up being way, way worse than like Gigabyte's auto recovery approach, which is on Intel. Gigabyte's auto recovery approach is basically we don't have any, and same goes for Asus. Actually, on DDR4, it's not too bad, but like my initial perception of like Asus DDR3 boards is that they're try-hard motherboards, because if you punch in memory settings that don't work, the board will be just boot looping forever. Like if you left it a day, it would just keep boot looping for like 24 hours or 48 hours or a month, a year. I don't think it would ever stop trying to post your crappy settings. So Asus motherboards were like the try-hard motherboards, where it's like there was an upside to this. If you had settings that were like borderline non-functional, as in they could sometimes post, they would sometimes post. But yeah, if you punched in something that didn't work at all, like the board would just keep trying to boot. And yeah. So that's kind of fun. Whereas MSI boards have always, in my experience, been really quick to give up on settings that don't work. Yeah, like if you punch in settings that don't work on an MSI motherboard, it'll pretty quickly realize, hey, like you've done something stupid, this isn't working. except if you get an AMD MSI motherboard, because AMD's auto recovery prevents MSIs from functioning correctly, and the end result is worse than what you'd get with a Gigabyte, Asus, or Asrock motherboard. And what's really frustrating is actually the auto recovery on some BIOS versions is really good, like from Asus, Asrock, or Gigabyte. Like the BIOS I have on the Aorus Extreme in my daily system right now, that recovers amazingly well. Like it, yeah. Which explains to, which is probably the reason why I never decided to update from it. But yeah, like with other, yeah. So that's kind of the thing. It's just like I don't really like. I've never had a terrible MSI board. And I've had, like, there are definitely some MSI boards that are very, very good. And actually, the Z690 Unify X would sort of be my blind pick for Z690. I should have pulled that board up as well. I don't know why I didn't. Yeah, I should have included this board. Like this is just a very good motherboard. Yeah. Like I'm really trying to think right now. Is there a complaint? Like any complaint? The VRM settings that are available in the BIOS are a bit The thing is, it's like if you just keep the VRM at 500 kilohertz, it works great. Then again, this does fall into the category of like BIOS settings that don't work as described or make things worse. I don't know. It doesn't really negative. Like, here's the thing. So on this board, if you crank up the switching frequency of the VRM, the voltage regulation gets way, way worse, not better. So if you have this board, what you should do is set the VRM switching frequency to 500 kilohertz and never touch it again. And things are great. But the problem is, you won't know that 800 kilohertz is completely bugged out unless somebody tests it with an oscilloscope because it doesn't show up properly in software. Like in software, you get some kind of erratic voltage readings, but if you look at it on the oscilloscope, you can clearly see the board has just freaked out for some reason if you set it to 800 kilohertz VRM switching frequency. And it also consistently gets worse voltage regulation as you increase the switching frequency. It's just that at 800 kilohertz, it gets really, really terrible instead of just being kind of a problem, which is what you get at like 600, 700 kilohertz or something like that. So yeah, but even then, like that I think is compared to some of the complaints I have for some other boards, I'd say that's a minor problem. The fact that like unintuitive VRM settings is like if you leave it on auto, it's actually fine because it defaults to 500 kilohertz. At least I think it does. It should. But yeah, like it's just like so there's my very long answer about like who's your preferred motherboard brand? Probably MSI. If I'm feeling brave and adventurous, I buy an Asus board or a Gigabyte board because with either of them you never know what you're going to get. With MSI, it's like it's probably like MSI I'd say at least it's definitely not going to be terrible. It might not be the greatest motherboard I've ever used. It still could be, right? This thing is very, very, well, the thing is, this is a very one-trick pony motherboard, right? This is a very, like, this board, I just use this board for everything with my 5950X. This thing is a memory overclocking beast, and that's about it. I mean, it's pretty good at CPU overclocking as well, but, I'm really biased in favor of having dual X8 is what I've realized. Like that's the main thing for me here is like X8, X8. I really want that. And this doesn't have that. And that's why I like this and not this. Also, I haven't tested the VRM performance of this board yet. There's a chance that this might rival the B550 Steel Legend. If it does, then I might just start using this more often. I really need to get around to testing that. Anyway, I should just end the video at this point because it is an hour and 14 minutes. So yeah, that is my very complicated and nuanced view of the various motherboard manufacturers. It's like I generally like, you know, I generally like Gigabyte boards, MSI boards, Asus boards. Asrock's BIOS is actually, the funny thing is like the Intel Asrock boards are generally not as jank as the AMD Asrock boards. Now that I say it, like Intel Asrock boards, like the X299 OC form. The funny thing though is like I've also the worst voltage regulation I've ever measured is an Asrock Z370 motherboard. So like, you know, this is why I like you can't freaking trust, because I don't think it's even intentional. I don't believe that some, whoever designed the VRM on the Asrock Z370 Extreme 4 was like, today I am going to make the worst VRM to ever be on a Z370 motherboard. And it probably isn't the absolute worst Z370 VRM, but I think in that price range, it's the worst by far. It's terrible. It's so bad. It's like 200 megahertz worth of core clock. Like, it is very noticeable that VRM sucks. But anyway, but I still don't believe that whoever designed that VRM woke up one day and was like, today I am going to design trash. Because that's not how it works, right? So, yeah, and that's kind of the thing, is just like I think most of it is just like, there's always some minor oversight that happens between like development and final manufacture, where it's like, oh, this board is great, but the VRM could really, be better. And it's like, well, why could it be better? I'm guessing they just didn't bother to test it. Or they did, and they were just like, well, I mean, it runs, right? Because like the VRM, like the voltage regulation, like there's a reason why CPUs come with such a huge voltage margin from the factory, right? Like why there's so much undervolting headroom on a CPU. It's because it has to, like, there's this massive tolerance band for garbage tier power delivery. And so a motherboard that's just kind of okay at voltage regulation is going to have no problem running any CPU. It's just that if you're absolutely, pushing the limits of the clock speed, it's kind of like, I really wish the voltage regulation was better. Like if you're manually overclocking and pushing the limits of the power delivery, that's when you're like, yeah, I really wish I had those like 30 millivolts of, 30 millivolts less undershoot, please. It would be very much appreciated. Or actually in some cases it's even like 100 millivolts less undershoot. And then that's when it's really, really, really noticeable, when you have when there's that much more undershoot on one motherboard versus another. That's when you suddenly get the like, well, both of the boards are averaging the same voltage, but one of them runs the CPU at like 5 gigahertz and the other at 4.8, right? So, yeah. I will say, actually, no, I remembered what I wanted to say about Asus not putting out a truly terrible motherboard. It's not that they've never put out a terrible motherboard. I've never measured a terrible Asus VRM. I've measured awful Gigabyte boards. I've measured awful Asrock boards. I've not measured enough MSI boards to say if MSI hasn't produced an awful MSI board, but I've tested quite a lot of Asus boards, even pretty cheap ones. And in terms of voltage regulation, I've never tested a truly terrible one. Like, I've measured some that weren't the best. I've measured some that were okay, but I've never measured one where I was like, oh my god, how is this functional? Which is what I've seen from both Asrock and Gigabyte, where it's like you see the voltage regulation on the oscilloscope and it's just like, I'm surprised that this doesn't blue screen at stock settings, but like that's what the voltage margin, like that's what the tolerance margins are for from Intel and AMD. So yeah. So I will say, like, Asus has never, like, they've put out VRMs that overheat. They put out VRMs that can't handle the CPUs that fit, like, not recently. This is like Z390. Like, there are Z390 Asus motherboards where if you don't put a fan on the VRM will just shut down if you're doing extended, like, rendering workloads, like Cinebench. But yeah, I've never measured an Asus VRM to have terrible voltage regulation. Thermals, yes. Voltage regulation, no. So that is noteworthy. Whereas for other manufacturers, I've measured both being terrible, except MSI. But again, I don't think I've measured enough MSI motherboards. So there. And this video is way longer than it needs to be. Probably completely screws me over on motherboard sampling. The thing is, I just want the boards to be better. Like, in a perfect world, I wouldn't have to make motherboard reviews, right? Straight up, I wouldn't have to make motherboard reviews because motherboards would be good. They wouldn't be bad. But the thing is, sometimes they suck. And I don't believe it's intentional, right? Like, I don't think anybody designing anything just wakes up one day and decides, I am going to design garbage. Or at least I hope they don't. I can totally understand, like, somebody wakes up someday and they're like, and I really don't feel like dealing with this today. But I don't believe that anybody would intentionally design a bad anything. If it's their job to design the thing, right? Like, as a joke, and like, we designed it wrong as a joke, I could understand that. But, like, you're not going to do that on a motherboard that you're trying to sell. At least I hope not. Because this wasn't very funny. Anyway, and I mean, this board wasn't very funny. Because it was terrible. Absolutely freaking horrendous. So, there. I am going to have to, like, think really long and hard about releasing this video, because I have insulted basically everyone except MSI, and the main reason I haven't complained about MSI is, again, I don't think I've tested enough MSI boards, straight up. So, yeah, but everybody else, it's like, I wish Asrock's BIOS wasn't so damn Asrock. I wish Gigabyte's BIOS, actually, I think Gigabyte's BIOS is okay. I wish Gigabyte motherboards were more consistent. I wish Asus boards would, like, also be more consistent. Like, how does this happen to such an expensive board? Like, how do you just screw up one of the memory channels that badly? And also, like, it's inconsistent. Like, apparently some of the early production boards are fine. It's not all of them that are terrible, which is just like that makes it worse. Anyway, yeah, so I wish, like, Asus and Gigabyte were more consistent in certain aspects. I wish Asus would stop cutting random features out of their BIOS, like VTT DDR control. Also, if they would adopt sensible naming conventions, that would be cool. I'd really appreciate that. And then and then there's MSI, where it's like, man, I wish I had more to say about MSI, but they really just kind of make okay board, like, great to okay to great motherboards. So, occasionally with some annoying bugs, though, like the whole BIOS profiles not saving thing. Still not as bad as this, or, you know, the BIOS on this board that kills memory controllers. Anyway, there. That's the end of the video. So, yeah, if anybody has, like, suspicions about my biases when it comes to the various motherboard brands, these are my biases. It's just like I don't even know. Make your own judgment. I guess I skew MSI in terms of recommendations, probably. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's probably the conclusion here, is just like, because the thing is, like, with MSI, I don't have to worry about, like, if I recommend somebody an MSI motherboard, I don't have to worry about getting complaints about the BIOS not doing things or being weird. So, like, at the very least, I don't have to worry about that. But, yeah. So I guess thank you for watching. I have a Patreon, which might be very useful considering I might have just screwed myself over with all of the motherboard manufacturers. Um, and I also have a Teespring store. There's a like Patreon, Teespring, and I have a Bandcamp. There's links to all of that down in the description. Potentially will be very necessary for me to be able to keep making content, considering everything I've said in this video. Um, yeah. But, I've wanted to do this video for a while. And, I'm most worried that Asus will get offended. Because, yeah, that would be, of all the manufacturers to get offended, that, they would be the, here's the thing, I can't offend Asrock any more than I already have, right? They already don't talk to me, so that's just fine. Yeah, with Asus, that's the one that I'm kind of worried about. Anyway, that's it for the video. I might not really... There's a very good chance that I might not release this. Mostly due to the risk of not ever seeing another free Asus motherboard again. Well, not ever again, but anytime soon. And, I would like to be able to test Asus X670 boards. So maybe I'll delay the release of this video until after they send motherboards. Oh boy. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, there's links for that down in the description. And goodbye.